10th grade, we're going to look at some things today that deals with Chapter 8. Okay. Chapter 8, with the Federalist years, it starts on page 138. So as we go through these things, I want you to pay attention. Of course, write some things down, some little notes. It won't be a very long video, but I will need you to read your chapter. And I do want you to read, for today, one of the things you need to read is 138 all the way over to 143, and there are questions there that I want you to do and answer them and submit it to me so I can see that you've done them. I also want you to take notes as I talk on a few things, and I have that down, and there will be a little notes quiz tomorrow on LMS, so be prepared for that. Okay, so first I want to talk about the critical period, the Federalist years, our early time, just as soon as the Revolutionary War was over, as soon as we did away with the Articles of Confederation, which you should be familiar with. We've gone over that before, the Articles, and of course then we moved into the Constitution and creating the Constitution. Of course, under the Constitution, our first government is going to be led by George Washington. And of course, he's going to become president in 1789. And one of the things that he is going to be remembered for, well, there's several things, of course, obviously, but what I really want you to remember about him, perhaps more than anything else, is that he was the precedent president. The precedent president. What do I mean by that? What is a precedent? Hopefully you may know this already, but a precedent is simply something that, we make decisions on things that have happened previously. We're kind of establishing precedents as we continue to do this online, virtual, remote learning. There's certain things that we try to do, and we're learning as we go along, of course. But precedent means that a simple way to look at it, and I think in simple terms, I believe, it's a decision based on a previous decision. You do something based on what has been done before. And one of the best things that President Washington did is he established, in a way, what we might call traditions, ways in which they did things that presidents way on down the road continued to follow them. They continued to do exactly like Washington had done. Okay, well, one of the first things he's going to do is he's going to establish a cabinet. And cabinets for presidents are advisors. They are helpers. The president is supposed to be knowledgeable, really, about everything. In order to govern our country, the president today has to know everything that's going on. And that's just an impossible task. Nobody can do that. So a president, if he's wise, he will put people into his cabinet, his advisory cabinet, that will help him, that are specialists in certain areas. And so President Washington established 4 cabinet positions. Now we have 15 today, 15 total cabinet positions. The most recent cabinet position was created during George W. Bush's administration. You may remember, you may not. Of course, you weren't alive then, or you weren't alive then. But 9/11 happened under George W. Bush's watch. And so the most recent cabinet position, the 15th cabinet position, is the Director of Homeland Security. And that happened, of course, as a result of 9/11. So George Washington, though, had 4 cabinet positions. He had, let me hopefully get this so you can see it. He had a Secretary of State. Okay. He had a Secretary of had a secretary, and this is their title, of course, secretary. They're departments of state, departments of treasury, and departments of, he had a secretary of war. Now that has since been changed. So today we refer to that as the Secretary of Defense. Okay? And then he also had a Department of, or Secretary of Justice. But he doesn't go by that title. Some of you may be familiar with it, but he goes by the title of Attorney General. Okay? Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and Secretary of Justice. Well, also during George Washington's administration, his vice president was John Adams. Now, the way they did the presidency and the vice presidency back then is not the way they do it today, thank goodness. Because what they did back then is the top two winners in the presidential election. The top one, the one that got the most electoral votes would be president, and the second would be vice president. So the first, of course, was George, and the second was John Adams. But anyway, in his positions for cabinet, he does put some predominant people that I do want you to know. For Secretary of State, he chose Thomas Jefferson. Hopefully you can see that. For his Secretary of Treasury, he chose Alexander Hamilton. Okay, I know this is getting kind of messy. Henry Knox was his Secretary of War. Henry Knox. And his Secretary of Justice was, what was his first name? Anyway, his last name is Rudolph. I can't remember his first name. But anyway. No, Edmund Randolph, I'm sorry. Edmund Randolph, not Rudolph. That would be easy to remember here at Christmas time, wouldn't it? Edmund Randolph. Yes, I am thinking about Miss Matherly's Christmas music. Okay, anyway, so you have those four, so you will need to know those. Edmund Randolph, Henry Knox, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and what their positions are. Now, of course, Secretary of State represents the country with other countries. Okay, so in other words, Thomas Jefferson would have been like, he would have been an expert in affairs that we dealt with other countries. And so he would have also been like an ambassador. He would have gone to other countries to represent the United States. That's still what the Secretary of State does today. Our current Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, he negotiates and discusses things with other countries. You'll see him all the time on the news, over visiting with China or over with Israel or what have you. He's always doing something representing the United States with other countries. Secretary of Treasury, Treasury of course is money. So the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who had been George Washington's aide-de-camp in the Revolution. He was very good friends, if you will, but he also just served him kind of as a secretary during the Revolutionary War. He is going to be the main wheeler and dealer on coming up with our currency system, our dollars. If you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, and initially every state had their own form of currency. And so now we need a uniform form of currency. Alexander Hamilton's going to be responsible for that. And he comes up with a plan that I want you to read about. So take note of this right now. I'm not going to go over it with you, but you need to read about it. It's called Funding and Assumption. It's Alexander Hamilton's plan. It's on page 1. It's actually on page 142. Look on page 142 where you can get that. Okay, so funding and assumption, you kind of need to be familiar with what that is. Read through that. That is the report on public credit. Alexander Hamilton also established a national bank. He was in charge of the money, so he had to come up with a way in which to do that, and so he comes up with the national bank. Let's see, what else for this first part that I want you to know? Some major things that happened under Washington. I do want you to know that the Bill of Rights are added to the Constitution. We've talked about those before. Hamilton, of course, establishes the Treasury, the idea of the national bank, and then the whole idea of the court system. Okay, the court system. I want to talk a little bit about that. Try to see if I can find another spot on the board. Our courts today are far more powerful than I think our founding fathers intended for them to be. And it's going to be interesting to see still in what's going on with the election as to whether or not the Supreme Court is going to play a role, if at all, in this election. It is a possibility, probably not a probability, but I don't know. I mean, what do I know about this sort of thing? I do think it's interesting, if for nothing else, than to see what's going to happen with the Electoral College, the legislatures, and the Supreme Court. It's all still, in some ways, up for grabs. But early on, in the Supreme Court, there's going to be a very important court case, and it actually comes on later on. It's after Washington's administration, and we'll kind of save that for talking about it then. But there is something that I want to go over with you first. It's called judicial review. Judicial review, the whole idea of how do judges review court cases and make decisions. Because if you remember, and we've talked about this before, but the president enforces the laws that are made by Congress. Congress makes the laws. The legislative branch makes the laws. And then the courts interpret the laws, and they actually apply the law at times. Well, early on in American history, there's going to be a Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Marshall, and he's going to come up with what becomes known as judicial review. And he says that there's a way in which the courts are designed to interpret the laws. One is a strict idea of the law, and one is a loose idea of the law. And so you have strict and loose constructionists. Strict and loose. And it has to do with construction. It's not the building of, but it really goes more to interpretation of. Okay, strict construction and loose construction. Some people, they've changed the names of this somewhat now. You'll hear them refer to people that are originalists. When President Trump recently put up for a position in the Supreme Court, Miss Barrett, when he nominated her and she was approved by the Senate and what have you, a lot of talk was done about her being an originalist, which actually means she was a strict constructionist. Because a strict constructionist is a person who looks at the Constitution and reads it strictly as what it says. They do not read between the lines and make it say a lot of things it doesn't actually say. That would be a loose constructionist. A loose constructionist will imply that there's things there that really aren't there. They will kind of read between the lines. It kind of just goes basically to interpretation. And some judges are strict constructionists, or like I said today, they refer to them as originalists because they're going on what the original meaning of the Founding Fathers was when they created the Constitution. And some people are very loose constructionists, which simply means that they They could say pretty much what they wanted to say. There's some problems with both of those ideas. Now, one of the things that President Washington is going to be remembered for is his farewell address. He did not have to give a farewell address. That wasn't really required. But he does give a farewell address, and he encourages Americans to do two things, both of which they have ignored. Maybe we shouldn't have, but you will need to know these as well. So, again, strict constructionism is reading the Constitution to say just what it says. You write that down however you want to say that. A strict constructionist is an originalist. The Constitution says what it says and you don't add to it. A loose constructionist adds to it. They say, well, the Constitution really implies this, and therefore. Okay, so in addition to that, in Washington's farewell address, he encouraged Americans to do two things, or not to do two things. He said, number one, this is Washington's farewell address, and to be honest, if we were in class and we had more time, I would probably give you a copy of his farewell address. And those of you that enjoy history and like history, and I know there's got to be probably none of you, but hopefully there is some of you, you should look it up. You should look up Washington's farewell address online and just read through it. You know, you don't have to study it and skim, but you can skim through it. But anyway, two things he says we should not do. One, he says we should not separate ourselves into political parties. Washington encouraged Americans to not separate themselves into political parties. Now, of course, we have done that, right? You guys know what our two main political parties are right now, Democrats, Republicans. There are many, many more. Like I've told you before, we have an American Communist Party, an American Socialist Party. We have the Progressive Party, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party. You know, save the planet, save the trees, kill the people. We have all of these different political parties. We have the American Pot Party. The sole purpose of that is to legalize marijuana. We have all kinds of political parties, but we really only have two main ones. But President Washington said we shouldn't do that. And technically, he was not of a political party. But we're gonna look at that again in a minute. I'm gonna explain that a little bit more. He said that we should not divide ourselves into political parties. He said that whoever wants to be president should run for presidency, and like cream rises to the top when you're churning butter. And most of you aren't familiar with that. I've churned butter before, but it's been a long, long time ago. But you make butter from real cow's milk, and you churn it, and cream will rise to the top, and that's what you skim off and make into butter. He said, like cream rises to the top, the best will rise to the top and be elected president. He encouraged us not to divide into parties. He also encouraged us not to get involved with foreign countries. He said, don't get involved with foreign countries. You know, you take care of things at home and don't be too involved. Now today, that's probably one of our biggest problems, is we're trying to be too global. We're trying to, you know, we buy and sell and we trade and we communicate with, and we're more of a globalized society now all over the world, which a lot of people would like to take that and make it more like a globalized religion or a globalized government, where we have a one world government that would control our environment and control everything we do. Heaven help us if we ever do that. But anyway, so he encouraged us not to divide into political parties, but one of the first things we do is divide into political parties. And I do want to talk very briefly about these two parties that are going to emerge, or really the main one, the Federalist Party. And technically Washington was a Federalist, although he didn't claim to be. But really, between the years where the Constitution was written in 1787 but it was not put into play until 1789. But those 2 years, 2 distinct factions or groups developed, and they were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, we have a federal government. Our federal government is the government that is over the entire country. Washington, D.C. is the headquarters, and that classifies as our central government or our federal government. So if you are a federalist, you believe that that government should be pretty powerful. You want the federalist to pretty much call the shots for about everybody. Now, anti-federalists are more like what we had under the Articles of Confederation. They believe more the states should be more in charge of their own government, and there should not be as much control from the federal government. Okay, so right off the bat, even though George Washington asked us not to do these things, that is one of the things that we do divide into. It are the Federalists and technically the Anti-Federalists, which later are going to be known as Thomas Jefferson's party, and they called themselves the Democratic Republicans, but we'll get to that later on. Now, there is going to be a good deal of conflict in Washington's cabinet and in his administration. One of the things he does as president, of course I established that early on, was, and I'm going to give you these without writing them on the board, but you should write them down, okay? One of the things he does, President Washington does, is he leaves. There was no 2-term limit when President Washington was president. That was added to the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment, so it's way on down the road. But after 2 terms, after 2 4-year terms, after President Washington had served 8 years, I mean, he served 1 term, 1 4-year term, ran for re-election, was re-elected almost unanimously. Everybody loved Washington. Washington could have been called a king. He could have taken that title, and he definitely did not want that title. He was afraid that we would dissolve into a monarchy. So he left after 2 terms voluntarily. President Trump would never do that. Most presidents in the last 50 years probably would never have done that. They would continue to run. They would probably continue to either get reelected or come pretty close to it. But anyway, after 2 4-year terms, after 8 years, President Washington said, I'm done. I've served my civic duty. I've been your president for 8 years, and now I'm going home. And he did. And like I said, he didn't have to do that. He also established what the presidency would be entitled. There were some people that wanted to give it a enormous name, Your Royal Highness, your whatever, just some elaborate title for the presidency. And he said, no, the president will be called Mr. President, and that's it. And they're still called that today. Mr. President is the formal title for the presidency, and we were given that by George Washington. There was also an event that took place during George Washington's administration. I'm trying to find what page it's discussed on. I don't see it, but it's called the Whiskey Rebellion, and I do want you to be familiar with that. So if I can find what page it's on, we will turn to that. The main thing about that is I want you to be able to compare that to Shays' Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion happened it's on page 147. The Whiskey Rebellion took place under George Washington's administration. It was similar to Shays' Rebellion under the Articles of Confederation. But the way it was handled was totally different. Washington immediately organized a military who he led to go and put down the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was in Pennsylvania, I believe. Hang on. Again, it's on page 147. well, I'm not really gonna ask you where it was. The Shays Rebellion was in Massachusetts. The Whiskey Rebellion, I'm pretty sure it was Pennsylvania. But anyway, it had to do with the same deal. There were a group of people that refused to pay their taxes. Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. But the big difference is we didn't have a powerful enough government under the Articles of Confederation to squash Shays Rebellion. George Washington proved that we were very powerful and able to squash the Whiskey Rebellion. And so this was in October of 1794, and it is discussed there for you on page 147. So just know that that was an event that took place during Washington's administration. And again, his farewell address is mentioned on page 148, and we've just about finished with Washington's administration of what I want you to really focus on. There is going to be some problems with other countries. There's going to be one of the problems, we don't really go to war with France or England, but we do have problems with France and England. And there is a treaty that is negotiated known as Jay's Treaty, and it prevented us from going to war with England again very quickly after winning the Revolutionary War. And so in that regard, it's important. And it had to do over the issue of impressment, and that is something I want you to know. Impressment. The British, especially, the French did it too, but mostly it was the British, would, on the high seas, of course the British have been known historically for a long time as having the best navy, but the British went to war with France. And there were some people that said we should help France out. There were some people that said we should help England out. We should side with England or we should side with France. There is going to be a group in America that divides. Some support France, some support England in their war with each other. Now, because there's been a French Revolution and the government that we were allied with during our revolution, during the American Revolution, no longer existed in France. And so we didn't feel like we were obligated to help them because that government was gone. But anyway, one of the things that they both were doing, but especially the English were doing, were on the high seas, the British Navy would stop American vessels and literally kidnap American sailors and impress them into their military service. They would accuse them of being traitors or people that had left the British Navy, which they hadn't been at all. They were American citizens. They weren't British in any way, but they would accuse them of being a British sailor that had deserted his post and joined with the American Navy. We didn't really have a Navy, but with the American ships. And so they would kidnap them and force them into the British Navy to fight the French. And of course, this was something you didn't do. The two countries, you don't get along very well with each other when you kidnap their citizens. So anyway, that was impressment, and that was one of the reasons why we almost went back to war with England right early on during George Washington's administration. So you should be familiar with Jay's Treaty prevented that. Impressment was the cause of that. We were not friends with the French government anymore because they had changed as a result of the French Revolution. You do need to know that the President Washington established the first cabinet, which are his advisors. He only had 4, and they were, I already gave them to you, Jefferson and Hamilton and Knox and Randolph. Not Rudolph, but Randolph. And of course, Hamilton was responsible for what was known as funding and assumption, which was an important policy, economic policy. Hamilton also established the National Bank, And also the Bill of Rights are added to the Constitution under Washington's watch. Now, Washington does not preside. He's the only president that doesn't govern from Washington, D.C. He actually, the capital, the early capital, or first capital, was New York City. So you will need to know that. New York City. So here's the deal. Here's what you need to do. You need to read this. I know my video's gone on longer than I really intended it to be, but you need to read Chapter 8, pages 139 over to the end of Section 1, which deals with President Washington. So it goes over to, technically, 149, and there's 4 questions there that you need to answer. Answer those 4 questions, send me a picture, and also be prepared, using your notes, to do a little quiz on this information tomorrow. And we're going to go right into John Adams tomorrow.